The Things Millionaires Refuse to See by Wealthy Mindset Audiobooks. Most people believe wealth is built by seeing more, knowing more, and reacting faster. Yet the quiet truth is that enduring success often comes from what is deliberately ignored. This audiobook begins where modern effort fails, revealing how clarity is not found in information, but in restraint. You work harder than ever. You read more articles, listen to more podcasts, scroll through more updates, and keep one eye on the future at all times. From the outside, it looks like diligence. From the inside, it feels like carrying a bag that keeps getting heavier, even though you can't remember what you put inside it. You tell yourself this is what responsibility looks like: staying informed, staying sharp, staying ready. Yet somewhere along the way, a quiet question begins to form. If I'm doing everything right, why do I feel so scattered? The exhaustion you feel isn't the kind that comes from honest effort or meaningful work. It's subtler than that. It's the fatigue of a mind that never rests, constantly switching gears, constantly scanning for what might be missing. You can sleep a full night and still wake up tired, because the weight you're carrying isn't physical. It's mental. It's emotional. It's the unspoken pressure to keep up with everything, as if falling behind, even for a moment, would cost you something important. What makes this even more confusing is that you are informed. You know what's happening in the world. You understand trends, risks, opportunities. You've done your homework, and yet clarity feels strangely out of reach. Decisions feel harder, not easier. Direction feels blurry instead of sharp. The more information you gather, the more uncertain you feel about what actually matters. It's like standing too close to a painting. You see every brushstroke, but you lose the image. Inside you, there's a constant tug of war. On one side is the fear of missing out, the worry that if you look away, even briefly, you'll miss the opportunity that could change everything. On the other side is a deep, unspoken fatigue, the weariness of always being on, always reacting, always processing. You don't say it out loud, but sometimes you long for a quieter pace, even as you're afraid of what slowing down might cost you. You begin to notice a strange pattern. The more you try to stay on top of everything, the slower progress seems to feel. Days are full, but results feel thin. You're busy, but not grounded. Moving, but not advancing. And that's unsettling, because you've been taught that effort equals progress, that awareness equals intelligence, that staying alert is the price of success. Questioning that belief feels almost dangerous, like doubting gravity. Yet the question keeps returning, softer at first, then more persistent. What if seeing more isn't the answer? What if the problem isn't that you're missing something, but that you're carrying too much? What if clarity doesn't come from adding another source of information, another perspective, another opinion, but from subtracting what no longer serves you? When you look around, you might notice something quietly intriguing. The people who seem to move forward with calm confidence don't always look the busiest or the most informed. They aren't reacting to every shift or comment. They don't appear anxious about every headline or market fluctuation. Instead, there's a steadiness about them, a sense that they're operating from a different internal rhythm. They move deliberately, not frantically. They listen, but they don't absorb everything. This can feel almost offensive in a world that rewards constant engagement. We're taught that paying attention to everything is a virtue, that responsiveness equals competence. But what if that belief is incomplete? What if there's another skill at play, one that rarely gets celebrated because it looks like absence rather than action? The skill of refusal. The discipline of not seeing certain things. Imagine trying to drive a car while watching every billboard, reading every sign, and reacting to every sound. You wouldn't call that awareness. You'd call it distraction. And yet, many of us live exactly this way mentally. We mistake constant input for insight. We confuse motion with direction. Over time, the mind becomes cluttered not because it's lazy, but because it's overloaded. The truth is, attention is not unlimited. Every thought you entertain, every piece of information you consume, asks for a slice of your focus. When too many things are asking at once, nothing gets the depth it deserves. This is where that heavy feeling comes from, not from lack of effort, but from lack of space. Space to think, space to decide, space to let ideas mature instead of rushing them into reaction. What if the calm progress you admire in others isn't the result of knowing more, but of choosing less? What if their strength comes from protecting their inner environment the same way others protect their money or their time? This isn't ignorance, it's selectivity. It's an understanding that not everything deserves access to your mind. As this idea begins to take shape, it doesn't arrive with fireworks. It arrives quietly, like relief. The possibility that you don't need to carry everything, that you're allowed to let some things pass without engagement. That clarity might not be something you chase, but something you create by guarding what you allow in. And as you sit with that thought, another realization starts to form. One that gently challenges everything you've been taught about effort, awareness, and success. Perhaps the path forward isn't about sharpening your vision further, but about learning what to look away from. And that realization opens the door to a very different way of moving through life, one we're about to explore together. Most people grow up believing that success belongs to those who know more information, more updates, more awareness of what's happening everywhere at once. We're taught, subtly and repeatedly, that staying informed is a form of intelligence, and that intelligence naturally leads to better decisions. So we consume news, opinions, predictions, trends, hoping that somewhere in all that input is the missing piece that will finally make things click. It feels responsible. It feels proactive. It feels like we're doing our part to move forward. But quietly, often unnoticed, a different philosophy begins to take shape among many of the wealthiest and most grounded individuals. Instead of absorbing more, they practice something far less glamorous: intentional blindness. They choose not to see certain things, not because they are careless or arrogant, but because they've learned, sometimes the hard way, that attention has a cost. Every headline read, every opinion entertained, every emotional signal reacted to draws from the same limited reserve. And unlike money, attention doesn't replenish easily once it's spent. Think of attention like a form of currency. You only have so much to spend in a day, and once it's gone, decisions become sloppy and emotions run the show. Wealthy thinkers understand this deeply. They don't treat attention as something to throw at everything that asks for it. They guard it. They budget it. They invest it where it matters most. This isn't about being uninformed. It's about being selective. There's a difference between awareness and overload, and most people live on the wrong side of that line without realizing it. Imagine standing in the middle of a busy intersection during rush hour, trying to listen to every car, every horn, every voice at once. From the outside, it might look like you're being vigilant. From the inside, it's paralyzing. You can't move forward because you're too busy processing everything happening around you. This is what modern life does to the mind. We mistake constant input for preparedness. when in reality it often leaves us frozen, unsure of which step to take next. The mind has a clever way of confusing stimulation with progress. When we're busy reacting, scrolling, reading, and responding, it feels like motion. It feels like momentum. But movement is not the same as direction. You can be incredibly active and still go nowhere meaningful. Many people exhaust themselves this way, working hard, staying alert, yet feeling strangely stagnant. Not because they lack discipline, but because their focus is scattered across too many competing signals. What truly keeps people stuck is rarely laziness. More often, it's mental clutter. A crowded mind struggles to prioritize. It jumps from one idea to the next, one fear to the next, without ever giving anything the space it needs to mature. Judgment becomes cloudy, not because the person isn't capable, but because they're overwhelmed. Decisions feel heavier. Doubt creeps in. And over time, confidence erodes, replaced by a constant sense of second guessing. Many wealthy individuals eventually recognize this pattern in their own lives. They notice that the more they tried to stay on top of everything, the less effective they became. At some point, something had to give, so they began to subtract. Fewer inputs, fewer voices, fewer emotional reactions to things that didn't directly affect their long-term direction. This wasn't an overnight transformation. It was a gradual realization that clarity isn't something you accumulate. It's something you protect. As the philosopher Seneca once observed, to be everywhere is to be nowhere. When your attention is spread too thin, nothing truly benefits from it. Wealthy thinkers take this idea seriously. They understand that not every piece of information deserves a response, and not every opinion deserves space in their mind. By refusing certain inputs, they preserve something far more valuable: the ability to think deeply and act deliberately. Once you begin to sense this truth, something inside you shifts. The idea of knowing everything no longer feels empowering. It starts to feel unsafe. You realize how easily your emotions can be hijacked by noise, how quickly your focus can be pulled off course by things that don't actually matter. Awareness, when unmanaged, becomes a liability rather than an asset. And that realization can feel both unsettling and freeing at the same time. It's unsettling because it challenges what you've been taught. Letting go of information can feel like letting go of control. But it's freeing because it opens up space: mental space, emotional space, decision-making space. You start to see that wisdom isn't about exposure to everything, but discernment about what deserves your energy. That progress doesn't require constant stimulation, but sustained focus. This foundational philosophy doesn't ask you to withdraw from the world. It asks you to engage with it more intentionally. To recognize that your mind is not a storage unit, but a workspace. What you allow into it shapes how clearly you can think, how patiently you can act, and how consistently you can move forward. And as this idea settles in, it prepares you for a deeper understanding of how restraint, not reaction, becomes a quiet advantage in life and money. In the next part, we'll explore how this philosophy shows up in daily decisions, and why those who learn to pause while others rush often end up building something that lasts. In daily life, this philosophy rarely announces itself loudly. It doesn't arrive as a dramatic decision or a sudden personality change. Instead, it shows up quietly, in moments that most people barely notice. It appears as restraint rather than reaction, as a us where there used to be impulse, where others feel the urge to respond immediately to messages, to news, to emotional triggers. You begin to wait, not because you don't care, but because you've learned that not everything deserves your immediate attention. Wealthy thinkers, especially those who have sustained success over long periods, develop an unusual comfort with pausing. They pause where others rush. They ignore where others engage. This can look strange from the outside, almost detached, but inside, it feels steady and intentional. They understand that urgency is often manufactured, and that reacting quickly is rarely the same as acting wisely. Over time, they come to trust that missing a moment is less dangerous than misusing one. This habit of restraint slowly reshapes the emotional landscape. Emotional discipline begins to form, not as suppression, but as understanding. Instead of being pulled by every spike of excitement or fear, emotions are observed rather than obeyed. And quietly, almost invisibly, this emotional discipline starts to shape financial discipline as well. Spending becomes calmer. Decisions become less reactive. The constant need to do something fades, replaced by a confidence in waiting for the right moment. What's striking is that this shift doesn't feel like effort. There's no grinding willpower involved. It feels more like relief. When urgency fades, decisions gain breathing room. You start to notice that many choices don't need to be made right now. Some simply need space, and in that space, clarity tends to appear on its own. The mind settles. The nervous system relaxes. You're no longer deciding under pressure, but from perspective. Think about decisions you've made in moments of heightened emotion, financial or otherwise. Perhaps it was an investment made out of excitement, or a purchase driven by anxiety, or a career move rushed out of fear of missing out. At the time, the decision felt necessary, even obvious. But with distance, many of these choices age poorly. Calm choices, on the other hand, tend to mature well. They may not feel thrilling in the moment, but they hold up under time and reflection. As this awareness deepens, something subtle but powerful begins to happen. Consistency starts to replace anxiety as the guiding force. Instead of oscillating between bursts of action and periods of doubt, your behavior evens out. Small, steady actions take the place of dramatic swings. This is where real progress often hides, not in intensity, but in repeatability. What you can do calmly and consistently ends up mattering far more than what you can do passionately but briefly. This consistency creates a feedback loop. Calm decisions lead to fewer regrets. Fewer regrets build trust in yourself. That trust reduces the emotional noise that once demanded constant reassurance. Over time, you stop needing to check, confirm, or compare as often. You begin to rely more on your own internal compass. And that compass, no longer pulled in every direction, starts to point somewhere clear. At this stage, many people notice a shift in how they relate to information itself. News, opinions, and updates don't disappear, but their role changes. Instead of flooding the mind, they are filtered. Awareness becomes curated rather than consumed. You start asking different questions, not "what am I missing?" but "what truly matters right now?" This question alone can dramatically change how you move through a day, a week, a year. There's an emotional maturity in this approach that often goes unrecognized. It takes courage to not react. It takes patience to sit with uncertainty. It takes confidence to ignore what others insist is urgent. But those who develop this skill often find that life becomes quieter in a meaningful way. Not empty, just clear. And clarity, once established, becomes a powerful foundation for both personal and financial growth. This philosophy doesn't promise quick wins. It offers something more durable: alignment. When your emotions, attention, and actions Begin to move in the same direction. Progress stops feeling forced. You're no longer fighting yourself or the world. You're responding thoughtfully, choosing deliberately, and allowing time to work in your favor. That's when discipline feels less like restriction and more like freedom. As you reflect on this shift from reaction to restraint, from urgency to patience, you may sense that it's pointing toward a larger realization. Awareness itself is not neutral. What you allow into your mind shapes how you feel, how you decide, and how you live. Learning to curate that awareness is not about shutting out the world, but about engaging with it wisely. And once you begin to see this, a wider door opens, a door that leads into a deeper exploration of how clarity is protected, how attention is managed, and how the quiet decisions you make each day quietly shape the life you're building. That is where we turn next. There is a quiet battle playing out inside almost everyone who cares deeply about progress, success, or financial security. It's a tug of war between logic and emotion, and it rarely announces itself clearly. Logic speaks in calm, patient tones. It plans, weighs probabilities, and understands that meaningful results take time. Emotion, on the other hand, is loud and urgent. It demands immediate reassurance, quick feedback, and constant proof that you're moving in the right direction. In the world of ambition and money, this tension becomes especially intense. Markets move, opinions shift, opportunities appear and disappear in headlines and conversations. Logic may suggest waiting, studying, or doing nothing at all. Emotion, however, interprets waiting as danger. It whispers that inaction means falling behind, that silence is a sign something is wrong. And so, many people act, not because the decision is wise, but because doing nothing feels unbearable. This is how motion becomes a substitute for clarity. Sending another email, making another trade, starting another project, buying another course. These actions provide temporary relief. They create the comforting sensation of control. Yet if you look closely, the relief is emotional, not strategic. The action wasn't driven by insight. It was driven by the need to quiet an internal discomfort. Over time, this pattern repeats, and the habit of reacting becomes mistaken for productivity. The contradiction is striking. The more you react, the less control you actually feel. Each reaction invites another trigger, another decision, another emotional response. Instead of simplifying life, constant engagement complicates it. You're no longer choosing your moves, you're responding to stimuli. And while it feels active, it's a form of surrender. Control slips away not because you're doing too little, but because you're doing too much without direction. Noise plays a powerful role in this cycle. It rarely presents itself as distraction. More often, it wears the mask of opportunity. A new idea, a trending topic, a promising shortcut. All of them seem reasonable on the surface. Engaging feels responsible, even ambitious. After all, isn't success about staying alert and seizing chances? But not all opportunities are equal, and not all deserve your attention. Noise disguises itself as importance, pulling you away from what truly matters. Over time, reacting begins to feel productive. Days fill up. Decisions stack on top of decisions. You're busy, engaged, and mentally exhausted. Yet when you step back, it's hard to see a clear line connecting effort to outcome. Direction erodes quietly. You move, but not toward something specific. Progress becomes harder to measure, and satisfaction grows thinner. The mind stays active, but the path forward grows foggy. Consider how often urgency drives your choices. How many decisions are made because they feel pressing, not because they align with a long-term plan. Urgency has a way of shrinking your time horizon. It makes tomorrow feel distant and irrelevant, while the present moment demands everything. In this state, patience looks like weakness, and waiting feels irresponsible. But this is a learned response, not an inherent truth. Most urgency is taught. It's absorbed from environments that reward speed over thought and reaction over reflection. Notifications, deadlines, social comparison all reinforce the idea that immediate response equals competence. Over time, the nervous system adapts to this pace. Stillness begins to feel uncomfortable, even threatening. Silence is interpreted as a problem that needs fixing. Yet silence is often where insight lives. When you sit with this idea long enough, a new question begins to form. What if most urgency isn't real? What if it's a habit, one that can be unlearned? This question doesn't demand an immediate answer. It invites observation. Notice how many things feel urgent in the moment but fade quickly when ignored. Notice how rarely true opportunities punish patience. In fact, many of the best decisions improve with time. Logic understands this intuitively. It knows that compounding, in both finance and life, favors steadiness over speed. Emotion struggles with it because compounding is quiet and slow. It doesn't offer instant validation. But when logic is given space, when emotion is acknowledged but not obeyed, decisions begin to feel lighter. You act less often, but with greater confidence. The shift doesn't mean suppressing emotion. It means recognizing its role without letting it steer. Emotion provides valuable signals, but it's a poor navigator. Logic sets direction. Emotion adds color to the journey. When the two are confused, progress suffers. When they are properly aligned, momentum builds naturally. As you reflect on this tug-of-war within yourself, you may start to see patterns that once felt invisible. The urge to act, the discomfort of waiting, the illusion of urgency, all of it becomes clearer. And with that clarity comes a subtle sense of power. Not the loud power of constant motion, but the quiet power of choice. In the next part, we'll explore what happens when you begin to step out of this reactive cycle, and why learning to do less, more deliberately, can lead to deeper progress than constant effort ever could. There's a powerful illusion many people carry without realizing it. The belief that successful people are always alert, always informed, always plugged in. We imagine them scanning markets before sunrise, tracking trends throughout the day, responding instantly to changes the rest of the world hasn't even noticed yet. From the outside, this picture looks convincing. It feels logical to assume that staying ahead requires constant vigilance. But when you look more closely at how long-term success is actually sustained, this assumption begins to crack. In truth, many failures don't come from ignorance. They come from emotional overexposure, from taking in too much, feeling too much, reacting too often. The human mind wasn't designed to process endless streams of information without consequence. When emotions are constantly stimulated by fear, excitement, comparison, or urgency, they lose their signal value. Everything begins to feel important, which means nothing truly is. Decision-making becomes reactive instead of intentional, and small missteps compound quietly over time. The cost of constant awareness is subtle, which is why it's so dangerous. It doesn't announce itself as a problem. Instead, it shows up as restlessness. The feeling that you should be doing something else, even when you're already busy. It shows up as comparison, where someone else's progress feels like a personal failure. It shows up as doubt, where choices are second-guessed, not because they're wrong, but because too many voices are whispering at once. None of these feelings are dramatic on their own, but together, they create a steady drain on your clarity. Over time, you start to notice how every opinion you consume pulls your internal compass slightly off course. One article nudges you toward caution. Another pushes you toward risk. A conversation sparks excitement. A headline triggers fear. Each influence is small, almost harmless by itself, but taken together, they create a state of perpetual adjustment. You're always recalibrating, always reconsidering, always wondering if there's a better move you should be making instead of the one you chose. This is how a life can become busy, yet strangely stagnant. Days are full. Your calendar is crowded. Your mind is occupied from morning to night. And yet, when you zoom out, it's hard to see meaningful progress. You feel like you're running, but the scenery doesn't change much. The energy you spend managing noise leaves little room for depth. Forward motion is replaced by lateral movement, activity without advancement. Progress begins to feel exhausting, not because the work itself is too hard, but because focus is fractured. When attention is split across too many priorities, nothing receives enough care to compound. Financial decisions suffer the same fate. Instead of being guided by a clear framework, they're shaped by emotion and comparison. You're not building patiently, you're responding continuously. And response, while necessary at times, is a poor foundation for long-term growth. At some point, a quiet realization begins to form. It doesn't arrive as a dramatic insight, but as a sense of relief mixed with concern. You start to see that distraction may be more dangerous than effortlessness, that doing nothing, intentionally, thoughtfully, can be safer than doing everything reactively. This idea challenges deeply held beliefs about hustle, awareness, and responsibility. But once seen, it's difficult to unsee. Think about how often effort is praised, regardless of its direction. We admire busyness. We reward responsiveness. We equate motion with value. Yet many of the most durable achievements are built during periods that look uneventful from the outside. Quiet years of steady investing. Long stretches of focused work without public validation. Calm decision-making that doesn't generate stories, but produces results. These moments rarely look impressive in real time, but they age well. Distraction, by contrast, feels impressive in the moment. It makes you feel engaged, informed, and involved, but it quietly taxes your emotional reserves. It fragments your attention. It invites comparison that erodes confidence. And slowly, it trains you to believe that reacting is the same as progressing. This belief keeps people running in circles, convinced they're moving forward because they're tired. The irony is that many successful people don't feel informed all the time. They feel oriented. They don't know everything, but they know what matters. They don't track every movement, but they understand the direction they're moving in. They accept that missing some information is not only inevitable, but beneficial. It protects their focus and preserves their energy for decisions that truly count. When you begin to internalize this, your relationship with effort changes. You stop measuring your days by how much you did and start measuring them by how aligned you felt. You notice that fewer decisions made with greater care outperform dozens made in haste. You begin to value clarity over certainty, depth over breadth, and consistency over intensity. This isn't an argument for disengagement. It's an invitation to discernment, to recognize that attention is not infinite and that where you place it shapes what grows in your life. The realization that distraction is more dangerous than effortlessness doesn't make you passive. It makes you precise. It encourages you to choose fewer inputs so you can produce better outputs. As this understanding settles in, it naturally leads to a deeper question, one that shifts the focus inward. If distraction is draining clarity, what restores it? And what happens when you begin to protect your inner environment with the same seriousness you protect your finances? That is where the next part of this journey begins. Transformation rarely begins the way we expect it to. Most of us are taught to believe that change starts with action, doing or trying harder, pushing further. When something isn't working, the instinct is to add effort, add strategy, add urgency. But real transformation often begins much earlier than action. It begins with noticing. Noticing what drains you, what pulls at your attention, what quietly erodes your energy without delivering anything meaningful in return. This noticing doesn't happen all at once. It emerges gradually, often during moments of exhaustion. You realize that certain conversations leave you tense long after they end. Certain habits scatter your focus instead of sharpening it. Certain sources of information don't inform you. They agitate you. At first, you might blame yourself for feeling depleted, but over time, a gentler understanding forms. The problem isn't a lack of strength, it's a lack of boundaries. Then comes a pivotal realization, one that subtly changes how you see progress itself. Clarity isn't something you add to your life like another tool or technique. It's something you protect. Like clean water or quiet space, clarity degrades when it's constantly exposed. You don't gain it by pouring more into your mind. You preserve it by controlling what enters. This insight alone can feel like a weight lifting off your shoulders. As awareness becomes more selective, decision-making changes almost immediately. Choices feel lighter, not because they're easier, but because fewer voices are competing for control. You're no longer juggling endless inputs, trying to reconcile conflicting opinions. Instead, you act from a smaller, clearer set of principles. Decisions feel deliberate rather than reactive, thoughtful rather than rushed. Even when outcomes are uncertain, the process feels right. This internal shift begins to show up externally. Inner calm reflects outwardly in steadier results. Financial choices become less emotional and more consistent. Work becomes focused instead of frantic. Relationships feel less strained because you're not constantly pulled away mentally. Progress may not look dramatic from the outside, but it becomes reliable, and reliability over time compounds into something powerful. One of the most profound changes happens in how you experience patience. Before, patience felt like waiting, like holding yourself back while others moved ahead. It felt passive, even painful. But as clarity deepens, patience begins to feel different. It feels like alignment, like staying true to a direction instead of chasing every possible shortcut. Waiting is no longer about delay, it's about timing. You start to notice that moving slower doesn't mean falling behind. In fact, it often means moving farther. When your energy isn't constantly drained by distraction, you have more to invest in what truly matters. Focused effort, even in small amounts, outperforms scattered intensity every time. The pace may feel unfamiliar at first, but the progress feels sturdier. This is where growth begins to feel natural instead of forced. You're no longer pushing against yourself, fighting internal resistance, or motivating yourself through pressure. Growth emerges from clarity, not compulsion. You act because it makes sense, not because you're afraid of missing out. And that difference is everything. Actions rooted in fear burn out quickly. Actions rooted in understanding endure. Consider how this applies to money. Many financial mistakes aren't made because people lack knowledge, but because they lack calm. Panic selling, impulse buying, chasing trends out of envy or anxiety. When awareness is selective and emotions are regulated, these mistakes become less tempting. You don't need perfect discipline. You need a protected mental environment where good decisions can surface on their own. This doesn't mean life becomes effortless. Challenges still appear. Uncertainty doesn't disappear. But your relationship with both changes. Instead of reacting immediately, you observe. Instead of rushing to fix discomfort, you ask what it's teaching you. This pause, this space between stimulus and response, becomes the birthplace of wisdom. It's where better choices quietly form. Over time, you may notice that you trust yourself more, not because you've mastered everything, but because you're no longer constantly second-guessing. Your internal signal is clearer, so you don't need as much external validation. Confidence grows not from certainty, but from consistency. You know how you operate. You know what you ignore. You know what you protect. And perhaps the most surprising part is how peaceful this transformation feels. There's no dramatic breakthrough, no sudden overhaul. Just a steady sense of alignment. Life feels less noisy. Decisions feel less heavy. Growth feels like a continuation of who you are, not a battle against who you've been. You begin to understand that success isn't always about acceleration. It's about direction held over time. As you sit with this shift, it becomes clear that transformation doesn't demand more force. It asks for more awareness, carefully chosen, intentionally protected. And this understanding sets the stage for something deeper still. Because once you learn to protect clarity, you're ready to explore how silence, patience, and emotional mastery quietly become your greatest advantages in building a life that lasts. Wisdom has a quiet way of arriving. It rarely shows up when the mind is overstimulated or rushing from one thought to the next. More often, it appears in silence, in the moments when nothing is demanding your attention and no one is asking you to respond. This can feel uncomfortable at first, especially in a world that celebrates constant input. Yet silence is not emptiness. It is space, and space is where understanding begins to take shape. Most people chase external success as if it will fill an internal gap. They believe that more achievement, more money, more recognition will finally create a sense of calm. But over time, a different pattern becomes visible. When success is built on noise and urgency, it doesn't bring peace. It compensates for its absence. The most grounded individuals often reverse this order. They cultivate internal steadiness first, and external success begins to mirror that calm rather than trying to replace it. This is where discernment quietly replaces indulgence. Imagine a gardener standing before a field. They don't allow every seed to grow simply because it can. They choose carefully, knowing that overcrowding weakens everything. In the same way, wisdom involves deciding what to let into your mind and what to leave out. Not every idea deserves attention. Not every opportunity deserves pursuit. Growth depends as much on what you remove as on what you plant. Letting go of constant input creates room for deeper thinking. When the mind is no longer flooded with updates, comparisons, and reactions, it regains its natural rhythm. Thoughts slow down. Patterns become easier to see. Instead of jumping from one stimulus to the next, you begin to think in longer arcs, weeks, months, years. This shift alone changes how decisions are made, especially around money and career. There is a paradox hidden here that most people miss. Ignoring more actually leads to seeing better. When attention isn't scattered, perception sharpens. You notice details that once went unnoticed. You sense when something truly matters and when it's simply loud. This isn't ignorance, it's refinement. By narrowing your focus, you widen your understanding of what's truly important. In a reactive world, calm becomes a quiet advantage. While others rush to respond, you observe. While others feel pressured to act, you wait. This doesn't mean you move slower out of fear. It means you move deliberately out of confidence. Calm allows you to choose timing rather than be pushed by urgency. And timing, especially in financial decisions, often matters more than speed. Emotional stillness plays a critical role here. It prepares the ground for lasting wealth, not just financially, but psychologically. When emotions are constantly triggered, decisions become fragile. They bend under pressure. But when emotions are steady, choices become resilient. You're less likely to chase trends, panic during downturns, or overextend during moments of excitement. Stillness doesn't remove emotion. It gives it a stable foundation. Think about how many financial mistakes are made in moments of heightened emotion. Fear convinces people to sell at the worst time. Excitement pushes them to buy at the peak. Comparison urges them to keep up with lifestyles they don't truly want. These decisions don't come from lack of intelligence. They come from lack of calm. When emotional noise is reduced, wisdom has room to operate. Silence also restores perspective. It reminds you that not everything requires your involvement. Markets will move. Opinions will change. Trends will come and go. Your job is not to react to all of it, but to stay aligned with your principles. When you're grounded internally, external fluctuations feel less threatening. You're no longer trying to control everything. You're focusing on what you can control. Over time, this approach reshapes your relationship with success itself. Success stops being something you chase frantically and becomes something you grow patiently. It's no longer measured only by outcomes, but by how you feel while pursuing them. Are you calm or anxious? Focused or scattered? At peace or constantly on edge? These questions become just as important as financial metrics. The world will always reward noise with attention. Loud opinions, dramatic moves, constant updates. They're easy to notice. Quiet consistency, on the other hand, often goes unseen until results appear. But those results tend to last longer. They're built on clear thinking, emotional balance, and deliberate action. This is the kind of success that doesn't need constant defense because it isn't fragile. As you reflect on this, you may realize that silence is not something to fear or avoid. It's something to protect. It's where your best ideas mature, where your values become clear, and where your decisions gain weight. In silence, you reconnect with what you actually want, not what the world is shouting at you to want. This understanding doesn't demand that you withdraw from life. It invites you to engage with it more wisely, to listen without absorbing everything, to act without reacting to everything, to build wealth, both inner and outer, from a place of steadiness rather than strain. And as this calm deepens, it naturally prepares you for the next realization, that when wisdom guides your attention, effort becomes lighter, progress becomes clearer, and the life you are building begins to feel less like a struggle and more like an unfolding. At a certain point in this journey, something quiet but meaningful happens. All the lessons you've been circling begin to converge into a single understanding. It doesn't arrive as a sudden revelation or dramatic breakthrough. Instead, it feels like pieces clicking into place, one by one, until the picture finally makes sense. What once felt complicated now feels clear, not because life has become simpler, but because your relationship with it has changed. You begin to look back at the original struggle with new eyes. The endless effort, the constant learning, the feeling of working harder, yet somehow feeling more lost. For a long time, it seemed like the answer had to be more discipline, more hustle, more information. But now, you can see that the struggle was never about effort alone. It was about direction. Energy without clarity doesn't lead to progress. It leads to exhaustion. This is where the definition of success subtly shifts. Success, you realize, was never about intensity. It was about clarity, sustained over time. Intensity burns bright but fades quickly. Clarity, when protected, compounds quietly. It guides decisions when emotions run high. It steadies you when the world feels noisy. And over long stretches of time, it produces results that frantic effort never could. When attention is respected, something remarkable happens. Emotion, philosophy, and practicality begin to align. You no longer feel pulled in opposing directions, wanting peace but chasing urgency, valuing patience but acting impulsively. Instead, your inner values start to guide your outer actions. Financial decisions reflect emotional steadiness. Daily habits reflect long-term thinking. Life begins to feel coherent rather than conflicted. What's striking is how simple this realization feels once it settles in, almost too simple to be revolutionary. There's no complicated system to master, no secret formula hidden behind layers of jargon. The shift is subtle. You stop trying to add your way to clarity and start subtracting your way toward it. You remove what distracts, drains, and distorts. And what remains is enough. Subtraction reveals what addition never could. When you remove constant input, deeper thinking emerges. When you remove emotional reactivity, better judgment appears. When you remove the pressure to keep up, you rediscover your own pace. This isn't about doing less for the sake of minimalism. It's about doing less so what you do matters more. In the absence of noise, your instincts sharpen. You might notice how reflection begins to replace striving. Instead of pushing forward blindly, you pause and ask better questions. Instead of reacting to every opportunity, you evaluate alignment. Reflection doesn't slow progress. It refines it. It turns motion into momentum. And over time, that momentum carries you farther than effort alone ever could. This is where many people misunderstand the nature of growth. They assume that stepping back means giving up, that silence means stagnation. But reflection is not retreat. It's recalibration. It's the moment when you ensure that the direction you are heading is still the one you want. Without reflection, effort can become a trap, keeping you busy while quietly pulling you away from what matters most. In financial life, this convergence is especially powerful. When clarity guides your attention, money decisions become calmer and more consistent. You're less tempted by short-term excitement and less shaken by short-term fear. You don't need to chase every trend or react to every fluctuation. You understand that wealth grows best in stable conditions, internally as much as externally. Emotional alignment becomes a form of risk management. This understanding also reshapes how you view time. You stop treating time as something to outrun and start treating it as something to work with. Compounding, whether in habits, investments, or relationships, requires patience and consistency. And patience becomes easier when you're no longer distracted by every passing signal. Time stops feeling like an enemy and starts feeling like an ally. Perhaps the most profound change is internal. The constant pressure to prove yourself begins to fade. You're no longer driven by comparison or the need to validate your pace. Confidence grows quietly, rooted in self-trust rather than external approval. You know why you act, why you wait, and why you ignore certain things. That clarity becomes a source of calm strength. This doesn't mean life becomes predictable or effortless. Challenges still arise. Uncertainty still exists. But your response to them is different. You meet them with steadiness rather than panic, with perspective rather than impulse. You understand that not every problem needs an immediate solution, and not every emotion needs to dictate action. This understanding alone reduces friction in every area of life. As all these lessons merge, the path forward feels less crowded. You're no longer carrying unnecessary weight. The mind feels cleaner. Decisions feel grounded. Progress feels honest. You're not chasing success anymore. You're cultivating it. And cultivation, by its nature, requires patience, care, and restraint. This is the quiet power of the philosophy you've been exploring. It doesn't demand constant striving. It invites thoughtful engagement. It doesn't promise instant results. It offers lasting alignment. And as reflection replaces striving, you begin to sense that you're not falling behind at all. You're finally moving forward in a way that can endure. With this understanding in place, the next phase becomes less about learning new ideas and more about reconnecting emotionally with yourself. Because once clarity is established, the heart has room to speak. And that is where the deeper transformation continues. There comes a moment of gentle clarity when the exhaustion you once carried finally makes sense. Not as a flaw in your character, not as evidence that you weren't strong enough or disciplined enough, but as a natural response to carrying too much for too long. When you look back now, you can see it clearly. You weren't failing. You were overloaded. The weight you felt wasn't the result of laziness or lack of ambition. It was the cost of trying to be everywhere at once, mentally and emotionally. For a long time, awareness felt like a virtue. Staying informed, staying alert, staying responsive. It all seemed responsible, even necessary. But now, you can see how unmanaged awareness quietly became a source of harm. It fragmented your attention, kept your nervous system on edge, and blurred the line between what mattered and what merely demanded attention. Nothing was obviously wrong, which made it harder to notice the damage. Yet over time, the mind grew tired, not from thinking too little, but from thinking too much about too many things that didn't truly deserve space. There is a deep sense of relief in realizing that you don't need to carry everything, that not every piece of information belongs to you, that not every problem is yours to solve, and not every signal requires interpretation. This realization doesn't make you careless. It makes you lighter. The moment you stop trying to hold the entire world in your head, something loosens inside you. The shoulders drop. The breath deepens. The constant background tension begins to fade. Acceptance plays a quiet but powerful role here. Not resignation, not giving up, but acceptance of your limits, your pace, your humanity. You stop measuring yourself against an impossible standard of constant readiness. The inner pressure to keep up, to stay relevant, to respond instantly begins to soften. You give yourself permission to move at a speed that feels sustainable rather than impressive. And in that permission, you find something unexpected: steadiness. Peace begins to feel different now. It no longer feels like surrender or retreat. It feels like consent. Consent to live in a way that honors your capacity instead of fighting it. Peace becomes a signal that you're aligned, not that you are avoiding life. You realize that calm is not the absence of ambition, but the presence of clarity. And clarity, once protected, brings a sense of quiet confidence that urgency never could. As peace settles in, urgency slowly loosens its grip. The constant need to act, to react, to prove momentum starts to fade. You still care, you still plan, you still move forward, but the frantic edge is gone. Decisions are no longer fueled by fear of missing out, but guided by intention. Time feels less like an enemy and more like a companion. Freedom arrives quietly in this space, not the loud freedom of rebellion or escape, but the subtle freedom of choice. You realize you can choose what you engage with and what you let pass. You can choose when to act and when to wait. You can choose depth over breadth, meaning over motion. This freedom doesn't demand attention. It simply exists, steady and reassuring. The mind responds quickly to this shift. Without constant stimulation, it begins to rest more easily in its own rhythm. Thoughts slow down, not because they're suppressed, but because they're no longer crowded. Reflection becomes natural again. Creativity returns in small, unforced moments. Even silence starts to feel nourishing rather than uncomfortable. The mind, finally given space, remembers how to regulate itself. You may notice how your internal dialogue softens. The harsh self-judgment quiets. The constant mental checklist loosens. You stop asking, "Am I doing enough?" and start asking, "Is this aligned?" That single shift changes everything. It replaces pressure with presence. It transforms effort into intention. And it allows you to experience your own life rather than constantly managing it. This emotional reconnection isn't dramatic. There's no grand declaration, no sudden transformation that others can see. It's private, internal, deeply personal, but its impact is profound. You feel more at home in yourself, less divided, less rushed. The world hasn't slowed down, but your relationship with it has changed. In this space, you begin to trust yourself again, not because you have all the answers, but because you're no longer drowning in noise. You can hear your own thoughts. You can sense your own limits. You can feel when something is right or wrong without needing constant confirmation. This trust becomes a quiet anchor, especially in moments of uncertainty. And perhaps the most meaningful part of this shift is compassion toward yourself. You see now that the exhaustion wasn't a personal failing. It was a signal, a message that something needed to change, not in your ambition, but in how you were carrying it. By listening to that signal instead of fighting it, you've opened the door to a more sustainable way of living. As your mind settles into its own rhythm, there's a sense that this is only the beginning of a deeper emotional understanding. The noise has quieted enough for something else to emerge: gratitude, humility, and a calmer awareness of what truly matters. And that awareness gently prepares you for the next reflection, where peace deepens and acceptance becomes something you can carry forward, even in an imperfect world. As the noise continues to fade, something unexpected begins to surface: gratitude. Not the loud, celebratory kind, but a quiet appreciation for what the overwhelm once taught you. You start to see that the pressure, the confusion, the restless striving were not wasted years. They shaped you. They clarified what doesn't work. And without them, you might never have learned the value of restraint or the relief that comes from choosing less. This gratitude isn't sentimental, it's grounded. You can acknowledge how difficult certain seasons were without wanting to relive them. You can admit that you were stretched thin, distracted, sometimes lost, yet still recognize that those moments sharpened your awareness. They showed you the cost of unmanaged attention. They revealed the difference between being busy and being aligned. And in that recognition, there's a quiet respect for the path you walked. You also begin to recognize growth in places you once overlooked. Progress is no longer measured only by milestones or finished goals. It shows up in how you think now, how you pause, how you decide. Even the parts of your journey that feel unfinished no longer feel like failures. They feel like works in progress, alive, evolving, and honest. You understand now that growth doesn't require completion to be real. There is a deep calm in realizing that perfection was never required. That belief alone releases an enormous amount of tension. You stop holding yourself to impossible standards of constant improvement or flawless execution. You allow room for mistakes, for rest, for uncertainty, and instead of lowering your potential, this acceptance expands it. When perfection is no longer the goal, sincerity takes its place. Life begins to feel slower, but not stagnant, gentler, but not weak, more intentional, less reactive. Your days are no longer dictated by urgency alone. You move with awareness, choosing where to place your energy rather than scattering it out of habit. Even routine moments feel different, less rushed, more present. Time seems to stretch, not because you have more of it, but because you're no longer racing through it. Thoughts still come and go, but they no longer demand immediate reaction. You notice them the way you might notice clouds passing through the sky. Some are dark, some are light, but none require you to chase them. This shift alone brings an immense sense of freedom. The mind learns that not every thought is a command, and not every emotion needs to be acted upon. In that space, wisdom has room to breathe. Awareness transforms as well. It becomes spacious rather than heavy. Instead of feeling like a burden you must carry, it feels like a field you can move through. You're aware without being overwhelmed, informed without being consumed, present without being pressured. This kind of awareness doesn't exhaust you. It supports you. It sharpens your perception while protecting your peace. You might notice how this affects your relationship with money, work, and ambition. Decisions are no longer rushed to escape discomfort. You're willing to wait, to observe, to let clarity unfold. You don't need constant reassurance that you're on the right path. There's a growing trust in your process, even when outcomes are still forming. That trust becomes a quiet source of strength. Emotionally, there's a new steadiness. You don't swing as wildly between hope and doubt. Success doesn't inflate you, and setbacks don't define you. You've learned that your inner state matters as much as your external results. And because of that, you protect it. You choose environments, habits, and inputs that support calm rather than chaos. This is no longer a strategy. It's a way of living. As this emotional reconnection deepens, your heart begins to prepare for a final understanding, one that doesn't feel urgent or dramatic, but complete. It's the kind of truth that settles slowly, then stays. You sense that everything you've experienced, the effort, the overwhelm, the reflection, has been guiding you toward something simple and enduring, something that doesn't require constant maintenance or defense. You feel ready now, not because you've mastered everything, but because you've softened. You've let go of unnecessary weight. You've accepted imperfection without surrendering intention. And in doing so, You've created space for a deeper wisdom to take root, a wisdom that doesn't shout but endures. This is the moment before closure, not an ending, but a gathering. A quiet pause where everything you've learned rests together, waiting to be distilled into one lasting insight. In the next and final reflection, that insight will emerge clearly, not as advice, but as a truth you already feel in your bones. As this journey comes to a close, one truth rises above the rest with quiet certainty. Wealth has always been as much emotional as it is financial. Money may be measured in numbers, but the decisions that shape it are born in the mind and heart. Fear, patience, confidence, restraint, these invisible forces quietly determine outcomes long before any transaction is made. When you look back now, you can see that the struggle was never just about earning more or doing better. It was about learning how to relate to uncertainty, desire, and time itself. This is where the core truth becomes unmistakably clear. Seeing less can mean understanding more, not because the world becomes smaller, but because your focus becomes sharper. When you stop trying to absorb everything, patterns begin to emerge. What once felt chaotic starts to make sense. You realize that insight doesn't come from volume, but from depth. And depth requires space, mental, emotional, and intentional space. This principle doesn't belong only to money. It stretches effortlessly into every area of life. Relationships improve when you stop reacting to every word and start listening for what truly matters. Work becomes more meaningful when you're not pulled in a dozen directions at once. Even personal growth feels lighter when you're not chasing every new idea, but committing to the few that resonate deeply. The same clarity that steadies your finances steadies your life. What's surprising is how gently this realization arrives. There are no fireworks, no dramatic moment where everything suddenly changes. Instead, there's a quiet recognition, like remembering something you always knew but had forgotten. You feel it more than you think it. A calm settles in, and with it, a sense that you don't need to prove anything anymore. You don't need to rush toward answers that reveal themselves naturally when the noise fades. At this point, something important shifts in your behavior. You no longer chase clarity. You protect it. You treat it as something valuable and fragile, not to be exposed carelessly to every demand and distraction. You become more selective about what you read, what you listen to, what you engage with emotionally. Not because you're avoiding life, but because you're choosing to live it with intention. Protection replaces pursuit. Silence becomes a strategic ally in this phase of life. Not silence as withdrawal, but silence as space. Space to think before acting. Space to feel without reacting. Space to let ideas mature instead of forcing them into action prematurely. In silence, you begin to hear your own reasoning again, unfiltered by urgency or comparison. And that voice, once drowned out, proves to be steady and wise. You may notice that decisions start to feel different now. They're less dramatic, less emotionally charged, but they're also more durable. You're no longer swayed as easily by fear or excitement. You understand that most opportunities don't disappear if they're truly right. You trust timing more. You trust yourself more. This trust doesn't make you passive. It makes you precise. Over time, this way of living builds a quiet confidence. You're no longer trying to outpace the world. You're moving at a rhythm that suits you. You don't need constant validation that you're on the right path because the path feels internally aligned. This alignment becomes the real reward. Financial stability grows alongside emotional stability. One reinforces the other, creating a foundation that can withstand pressure. Looking back, you might realize that much of what once consumed your attention was never essential. Opinions that stirred anxiety, information that created urgency without clarity, comparisons that eroded contentment. Letting go of these things didn't shrink your life, it expanded it. By ignoring what drained you, you made room for what nourished you. And in that trade, you gained far more than you lost. This is where wisdom settles into its simplest, most enduring form. What you ignore shapes who you become. Ignore noise, and you become clear. Ignore constant urgency, and you become patient. Ignore comparison, and you become grounded. These are not small changes. Over time, they define the quality of your decisions, your relationships, and your peace of mind. You don't need to remember every idea from this journey. You don't need to apply everything at once. Wisdom doesn't demand urgency. It invites awareness. The most important shifts will happen naturally as you continue to protect your attention and honor your limits. Growth will follow, not because you're pushing for it, but because you've removed what was holding you back. As you step forward from here, you do so with less noise and more confidence, less pressure and more clarity, less chasing and more choosing. The world will remain loud. Opportunities will continue to compete for your attention. But you now understand something many never realize. You don't need to see everything to move forward. You only need to see what matters. And with that understanding, you carry a quiet advantage into whatever comes next. Not because you know more than others, but because you've learned what to ignore. Thank you for listening, and more importantly, for allowing yourself the space to reflect. In a world that constantly asks for your attention, choosing to pause and listen is an act of quiet courage. It's a sign that you're no longer just reacting to life, but engaging with it thoughtfully. That willingness to slow down, even for a moment, creates room for something meaningful to take root. As you step away from this reflection, remember that clarity doesn't arrive through force or urgency. It grows naturally where attention is honored and protected. What you give your focus to will shape how you think, how you decide, and how you feel. When you treat your attention with respect, it begins to repay you with steadiness and insight. Over time, this simple practice can change the way your days unfold. May you move forward feeling lighter, not because life has fewer demands, but because you are no longer carrying what was never meant to be yours. May you feel calmer, not because everything is certain, but because you trust yourself to navigate uncertainty with patience. And may you feel more aware, not of everything happening around you, but of what truly matters within you. There will still be noise. There will still be urgency knocking at your door, but you now understand that you don't have to answer every call. Peace can guide what you choose not to see, just as wisdom guides what you choose to focus on. In that balance, life becomes less about constant striving and more about intentional living. Take this calm with you. Let it shape your choices quietly. And as you return to the rhythm of your own life, may you do so with a clearer mind, a steadier heart, and the confidence that comes from knowing you don't need to see everything to move forward.